Hello everyone, my name is Chris DeVries, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the recent changes in regulations relating to 14 CFR Part 91, Living History Flight Experiences. So an overview, this is what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to be talking about what a living history flight experience is, the history of these flights, the 5 rules for exemptions so that these flights can happen, 2019 crash, and then the 14 CFR Part 91, I'm going to really dive into the regulations. There's an NTSB report back in 2021 that I'm going to talk about, as well as the moral question of, is this safe to do while preserving our heritage? Is this still the smart thing to do? As well as just talk about our Christian beliefs, or excuse me, our worldview of origin and values, and then the gift of free will given to us by God. So the past couple of years, there have been significant changes to 14 CFR Part 91, Living History Flight Experiences. The FAA needs to take the recommendations offered by the NTSB from that NTSB action report, which I'll be talking about, and apply them to FARs applicable to these flights. And if the FAA can't make the recommended changes, these living history flights may need to be grounded for the safety of the public. So what is a living history flight experience? So living history flight experience is basically a flight aboard a historical aircraft. You actually can get on board the airplanes here on the right here. You have a B-24 Liberator that's actually in flight, and people pay for the opportunity to get on the aircraft and walk around in flight. On the left, you have a C-47 Skytrain, the famous aircraft used during D-Day to drop paratroopers. So people paid to have the opportunity to fly on board. There are plenty of other aircraft available. Aircraft like the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, the B-24, like I said, and the C-47, even the F-4 Phantom. So more and more aircraft are coming online to have the opportunity to fly on. These aircraft are owned and operated by non-profit organizations like the Collins Foundation. They maintain, train, and display these aircraft on their own with no added government or outside support. The intent of these organizations is to basically commemorate our heritage as well as honor those that serve to defend our great nation. Maintaining and operating these working aircraft is not cheap, and in order to operate these aircraft with airworthy exemptions, these organizations basically have to maintain a 501c3, or like I said, a non-profit organization. Since they're not able to make a profit from the demonstrations, from these demonstrations or organizations, organize events, they offer rides on the aircraft for a modest fee. These flights can be as short as a couple minutes or as long as an hour. Some of the flights offer the opportunity to get up and walk around and act as a crew member on board the aircraft. So flying is not obviously a cheap activity, as most of us know in the aviation community. So when the aircraft in question is over 70 years old, owning and operating these aircraft is not, as a nonprofit, can be obviously really expensive. So in order to subsidize these costs, these organizations offer these flights for a fee. An example, just looking online, would be flying with the American Air Power Museum, which ranges anywhere from $300 to $400 for about a 20-minute flight, and that would be in a North American AT-6. All the way up to $18,000 for 45 minutes in an F-4 Phantom, which is a Vietnam-era fighter jet, and that's offered through the Collins Foundation. The problem with how old these aircraft, they're classified by the FAA as limited category aircraft. So the living history flight experience falls under 14 CFR Part 91, which is general operation and flight rules required for flight. Under 14 CFR Part 91, organizations were filing for exemptions to the specific CFR 91.315 that states that no person may operate a limited category civil aircraft carrying persons or property for compensation or hire. The exemption allows for living history flight experiences to operate at a limited category while still charging to fly. The first exemptions were filed by the Collins Foundation in 1996. So even though the decisions was contrary to the FARs and the guidance in 14 CFR Part 91, the FAA claimed preservation of U.S. aircraft history is in the public interest, much like the preservation of historic buildings and landmarks, and the public has expressed a desire to experience flight in historic aircraft. The FAA would also require additional maintenance-based checks and inspections outside of the regularly scheduled and required checks in order to assure the safe operation of these old aircraft. However, the FAA did not specify how those checks would happen. In 2004 and in 2007, the FAA updated guidance on what type of aircraft would be allowed, exemptions resulting in a wave of increased exemption requests, so much so the FAA had to issue a moratorium on any new requests in 2011. The FAA received requests like single-engine historical aircraft like the AT-6, like I talked about earlier, or the P-51 Mustang, allowing flight instruction in historical military aircraft like the F-4 Phantom, like we talked about, or the A-4 fighter jet. Over the next 4 years, the FAA worked with the public to specify what historical aircraft can fly and how they manage admittance of an exemption for living history flights. The FAA came up with these 5 rules in order to grant an exemption. The first rule, the aircraft must be historically significant, which means it must be greater than 50 years old, must have been U.S. owned and operated, not currently being flown in the military, and only a few left remaining. Second, it must have a designated representative that the FAA can contact and a proper chain of command for ownership, flight, and maintenance. Third, the petitioners must adhere to a safety risk management and equivalent level of safety principle in order to be filed with the FAA. The fourth, they must show that they have an adequate set of rules and regulations for maintenance and passenger similars to Part 135 operations. Finally, as part of reviewing the petition, the flights are limited to ferry-type flights and not training, aerobatics, or having passengers fly the aircraft. So the FAA maintained these rules until the unfortunate crash of the B-17 Golf in 2019. A B-17 Golf crashed in Hartford, Connecticut in October of 2019. The NTSB found that approved inspections in accordance with FAR 91.409, Echo, Fox, and 4 and Golf, and how they were to operate the aircraft in compliance with military technical manuals was not being complied with. The FAA rescinded and refused any additional exemptions requests until further investigations could be conducted. The decision to rescind any and deny additional exemptions was taken in the interest of public safety by the FAA. After a meeting in March of 2021, the FAA received numerous suggestions for changes in 14 CFR Part 91 flying operations from the NTSB. The report discovered numerous issues with 14 CFR Part 91 flying from 7 different crashes, and then this crash in particular being one of them. The FAA is still learning to properly regulate living history flight experiences properly, and they're still working on implementing the recommendations offered by the NTSB. So like we've talked about, living history flights fall under Part 91, which is a general operation and flight rules required for flight. Part 91 is broken down into subparts A through N and appendixes A through G. It's pretty substantial. It's a pretty large document. But under Part 91, organizations were filing for exemptions to, like we talked about, CFR 91.315, stating that no person may operate a limited category civil aircraft carrying persons or property for compensation or hire. This exemption allows for living history flights to operate at a limited category while still charging to fly. The 2019 B-17 crash drove considerable analysis into Part 91 operations, and the NTSB had to come up with 6 new recommendations to update the regulations. The NTSB also reemphasizes 4 recommendations from previous accident reports throughout the past few years prior to this accident. The following are outlined in recommendations to help the FAA improve Part 91 operations and improve safety practices in general. So the first recommendation outlined by the NTSB to the FAA was to reassess safety standards and regulations associated with Part 91 revenue passenger carrying operations. These standards and regulations would include requirements for initial and recurring training for both aircraft operators, maintenance, and management policies and procedures. The second recommendation, outlined by the NTSB, identified shortcomings for revenue passenger carrying operators, avoiding stricter regulations and oversight primarily associated with living history flights. Certain oversights in these flights include air combat, extreme aerobatic experience flights. Passengers are able to fly with organizations and demonstrate fighter-style maneuvering. Once these shortcomings were discovered, the NTSB recommended that the FAA use that information to update these types of flight operations to the national safety standards. The third recommendation by the NTSB revised FAA Order 8900.1, which is the Flight Standards Information Management System, ultimately calling for a larger update. Adding guidance for inspectors who manage the operations for living history flight exemptions so they can detect any issues associated with the operations and properly manage the risk associated with flying these historic flights. In 2022, the FAA actually canceled the 8900.1 and issued the 8900.1 Alpha. This updated guidance decommissioned the Flight Standards Information Management System. It basically directed the activities of aviation safety inspectors and flight standard services. It provides updated guidance for aircraft accidents, incidents, and investigations, as well as implementing the new Aviation Safety Action Program, or ASAP. The ASAP is a system designed to allow confidential reporting on anything aviation related, allowing for more open and honest feedback and reporting to kind of help potentially catch any issues before they occur. The 4th, 5th, and 6th recommendations by the NTSB recommended the development and update of a database of passenger carrying operations in accordance with the safety recommendation on previous NTSB documents, basically in order to safely manage these operations. The recommendations also requested a safety management system be implemented, as well as ongoing oversight of these systems once they've been established. So basically, after reviewing these regulations and recommended changes, the next step is to basically ask ourselves, when are these organizations no longer safely own and operate these aircraft? And is the high level of risk associated with these flights worth honoring their heritage? So the B-17 crash in 2019 highlighted the dangers associated with these flights. As stated by Alan Woke, the founder of Woke Law Firm, one of the nation's premier aviation law firms, no one alive who currently maintains or flies one of these aircraft ever did so in the service. No one alive who currently flies or maintains these aircraft went through a military training program for them. So to his point, these aircraft required government support to own and operate. So as these aircraft continue to age and parts become more limited, at what point should these aircraft be grounded? In 2021, the family members of someone lost on the crash sued the Collings Foundation for negligence. The NTSB report came back with several factors in the crash and loss of life, including many of the passengers were not familiar with the layout of the aircraft and were not able to actually evacuate quickly enough. Passengers were not even instructed to put safety belts on, which is a requirement per 14 CFR 91.107. The regulation strictly states that the pilot and command will not take off until all passengers aboard have properly shown how to fasten and remove the seatbelt, which is why anytime you get on an airliner, that's why your flight attendants are going to tell you that straight out of the CFR. So basic adherence to straightforward FARs like this kind of begs the question of, are more stringent rules and regulations regarding living history flights going to be honored? The FAA has a responsibility to ensure that these aircraft are adhering to stricter safety and maintenance practices, which is why they had a moratorium in 2011. Even with updated rules and regulations as previously discussed, aircraft may still crash just based on the age of these aircraft and diminishing available parts. With how old these aircraft are and the continuing age of these aircraft, can the FAA enforce enough rules and regulations to keep these aircraft safe for the public? The other question is, at what point does the FAA weigh public safety over honoring our heritage? Lucky for us, we have God, who has provided us with a moral framework and virtues to make tough decisions. So from a biblical worldview, origin and values are the 2 points I found most relevant to this discussion. Origin is important because we were made in God's image. That is where we come from. These living history flights help us remember as citizens what others have done to protect our rights and liberties, to pursue life, liberty, and happiness. God provided Moses with a set of commandments and a set of values that we must adhere to as Christians. These heritage flights remind me of the values my grandparents that had helped basically form this great country, and how we must hold our values as Christians and Americans. While we may have to say goodbye to living history flights as the aircraft become too old to allow the average person to fly on board, we can never let go of our Christian values, no matter how difficult. The choices we make, especially those that are spiritual and moral in nature, serve as reminders that we are made in God's image. In conclusion, as unfortunate as it would be to see such iconic aircraft like the B-17 or B-24 grounded, I believe the FAA needs to set a flight safety standard which these aircraft must maintain to carry passengers. These standards must be maintained, and if violated, they are no longer airworthy and may not fly due to risk to the public. This is everything we discussed today. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me in the classroom discussions or via my school email. Thank you, and God bless.